Okay, so after last time I posted the enhanced input to hook up DualShock, there are people talking about how do we map the DPad input properly. So for raw input, like when we hook up, basically this guy here, the DPad is not actually like a directional, like up, down, left, right when Unreal takes the input. So if you go to your settings, you will see that the directional pad is this point of view hat. So this tutorial should work for controller that has this kind of like input as well. So this is the default status when DualSense is hooked up wired. Then the D-pad becomes this point of view hat. So any controller with this, if you can hook up with the raw input, you can use the same method for doing the input mapping. Yeah, so that's that for introduction. And if you don't know how to hook up with raw input, please refer to my previous video. And then just to show you quickly what the result looks like. So in order to get in order to get the project file out in a smaller size, I have to make like a blanket project. So like up, down, and then let's see, up, 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 right, 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 down, down, left, 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 up, right. So everything is here, up, down as well. I just basically move up on the circle button and down on the X button. Basically, there's nothing tricky. Okay, here we go. So after you do the, let me quickly go through the plugin settings. So in raw input, you need to get these vendor ID and product ID. And then basically you can leave everything at default except the stick axis. So which is 3, 4, 5, 6 for DualShock. It might be a different axis for different controllers, so you have to figure out yourself. And then for the stick one, you have to check this game stick checkbox, and then that's pretty much it. Like, don't leave everything untouched. And then we can close this guy, and then if you enable raw input plugin, you have to restart a project. Now let's go to the most basic asset here. So in order to, this is basically a migration of the traditional Unreal Engine 4 input like thing, because it was in the project settings, and then it doesn't support some other functions, and enhanced input basically replace that one, and then I think it's a much better progression. So we are not talking about all these here. We are just talking about the D-pad one. So if you see here, I have a D-pad all, which allows me to output the actual values, and then the 8 direction following here. I no longer need to put the trigger or modifier directly with the default input collection asset thing. I can do it directly into the InputAction. So like a setup is much easier. So I just need to specify which axis. So you can see like all the D-pad actions are all on the same axis. There's an important part where I did to enable both the number output, value output, and the actual input action output, which is this guy here. I basically doesn't consume the input for the IA D-pad all, and then that's how I can get both input during play. So if I go to my pawn, you can see I have the all to print out the actual action value, and then everything like up, down, left, right, I have a function to print out what's the action name is. So let me go back to the play to test that out again. I can do up and then you say DPad1 and then IA DPad up, right? So it just basically print all the value. Yeah, there we go. So the blueprint itself is pretty simple. Like if you see the project file, I put it in the either the tutorial page or the description. It's very simple. Like this is the basic setup for using the enhanced input to get point to our collection asset, and then movement input and everything else is pretty much copied over from the third person template. I use a default pawn, so I don't have to have all the mannequin and everything include in the project file, so it should be like a very minimal sized, and there's nothing else, right? So this is like a really bare bone project you can use. Okay, there we go. So how do we do the DPad mapping? So, and when we have the default action here, we can have the input action. Say let's go to the up part, right? So in my previous tutorial, I have this DPadAxis modifier and DeadZone up. For some reason, even though the DeadZone in description says it will remap from lower threshold to upper threshold to remap back to 0 to 1, but somewhere during the 5.2 update you can no longer put this value above 1. If I say put 1.2, it will still go back to 1. So that's something you have to pay attention to before you pass the value down to this modifier here. So that's a new change. The rest is pretty much staying the same. So for axis, you need to use this axis 1D as our input. We have both things. We have the trigger and the modifier. The modifier will run fast, and then the value will pass into trigger to decide if your action is getting triggered or not. Now let's see how we create this DPadAxis modifier, because a commenter say I should show everything from the beginning. So how do you create this modifier? You basically right click blueprint class, and then if it's high hidden, you expand this all classes, and then you type in input modifier like this one, and then you select, and then you can say, you know, DPad. Oops, I don't know why it does that, but it tends to do it. DPadAxis. Let me access new test, right? So this is a new. I'm attempted to create the same one. So what you do is once you create a new one, you can override the function, and then we actually just want to override this raw value right here. So, and then you need to hook up all three like that. So you run through the parent first, and then you break the value, and then you can make input action value, and then basically you can just hook about everything here, and then that's the basic of it, right? So and then you do your axis mapping in between these two nodes, right? So I'm just going to leave this out. I'm not going to just recreate everything from scratch. So this is how you create a new input modifier. And then what I did in the actual modifier getting used, see, it's exactly the same, but as I put in the description, because it goes from something to 1.143 in my older video. So what I do is I use 1.143 to do a minus the actual input value, and then I reverse the direction, right? And then because of the DeadZone no longer allow value like greater than 1, I have to divide it to normalize it back from back to 0 to 1, and then that's how we do the axis DPadAxis modifier. Okay, so when you got this, and then you go to your actions. When you create an action, you can just basically add new one. How do you create a new actions? Let's do a one like DPad. You just create a blueprint class, InputAction, InputAction. InputAction. Oh, it's a data asset. So maybe we can do this. It's a data asset, should be here, miscellaneous data asset, and it will ask you to pick a class and then just put InputActions. Yeah, that's how you create a new one. Is it actually that? DPad new. Okay, I DPad new. So and then it will be a new data asset for you to do, and then for axis you just change it to 1D and then start putting in the trigger and modifiers, and you pretty much don't have to change anything else. The more important action changes will be this one. Do you consume the input at all? This is when, if the game paused, do you still catch the input for this action? Reserve or mapping, I don't know what this did, and this is what the value type is, and then trigger is to decide, you know, how you gonna trigger this action. If you don't have anything, it just when you press it triggers. Modifier is to allow you to do all sorts of changes to the values, right? So that's that. Let's close this guy and go back to our DPad. So what I did here is I first did my axis modifier, which remaps the DPad value to back to 0 to 1. So up is 1, and then the top left, up left is the minimum value, and then if I release the DPad, it will be 0. DeadZone basically say if it's 0, I'm not going to trigger this input action at all, right? So what you get is this. So you know, up, down, left, right, everything is there. So up is 1, and then when I go to clockwise, and then the value just gradually becomes smaller, smaller, and then to up left. And then if I release, it'll be 0, and then the input would stop. With the DPad all, what you can do is you can actually do any of your remapping here and then call different action as well, but I think it's a less convenient way, you know, for longevity wise, because you're banking on this and you cannot use it to making combos if you want to use DPad for combo like I do in Hadoken or something. So we need to actually make all the individual actions like that, right? And then we just need to make sure we have that. So before we do the next one, we need to actually create a new enum. So when you create an enum, you just basically, yes, don't forget to let me see, I forgot where is it in. Okay, yeah, here. So it's in the blueprint enumeration. So when you have that enabled, you can say, you know, just create a bunch of lists and then start typing in, you know, like say item 1 and then item 2, and then it will show up in the selection if you use it as a parameter. So let me delete that one, delete this guy, delete. Oh, we also don't need this guy. Let's delete that as well. And we have something new here. Yes, let's delete that as well. Okay. So once you have this, I just basically do this so we can have the trigger modifier thing to pick a direction instead of output a float value. And then it's the same thing. So how do we do this trigger value thing? Is to right click, do a blueprint class, and then you just type input trigger here. If it's time based, it has something like a, you know, if you hold down for like a 0.5 second something and then it can trigger, but because we are doing the simple action, we are just doing this input trigger here, and then select, then you can do, okay, I want to have DPad trigger new, like that. And then inside you have different functions to override, but what we want to do is this override this update states here. I'll show my code on the actual node, like here. See, it's the same. It's just like I updated, so I didn't actually use the parent result function. I get the modified value, and then this is axis is after the trigger and DeadZone, right? And then I input all my values I got from the DPad all here to map to this trigger direction. So when you create a variable and then change this back to enum DPad, oh sorry, DPad, yeah, DPad. So this is what we created, and then it should show up when you create whatever name you have, and then you select that, and then it will be an enum. Well, how do you create this selecting? You just basically drag and then type select, and then you can have different format value if you want. You know, I don't know what kind of value you want to drive the actual selection, but I'm using a float value from the axis, so that's that. And because the printing value is not actually really accurate, so you can use like equal here. If you use equal, probably only 1 and 0 will be correct, and then all these other non-precise value will not get correct input or get correct trigger. So what I use is the near equal, which put the tolerance to 0.002. Now you can tweak this a little bit if you want, but that's what I did, and I make sure it's a axis 1D type of input, so you know, to exclude the binary one, and then pretty much like that. So if it's axis 1D and then it fits the selected value here, then I output triggered, otherwise I don't trigger. I don't trigger the action. Okay. So once that's done, when you have that done, you go to the action and then say, let's say up, right? Up here. So this you create this basically the same thing, and then whatever right, I forgot one important part. So if you want your trigger direction variable to be exposed here so you can change, you need to expose the parameter, which is like that. Let's modify. Let me see the trigger value. So when you have this value created and you want to expose it to user, you need to use this instance editable checkbox here. Once you check it, then it will show up. I can show you a different one which should not have any value, say test bool, right? And then I just show instance editable, even though it doesn't have any actions. And then I go back to this DPad app, you will see test bool show up, right? So now you can drive this actions. Let me remove that because that's not required. Delete. Oops. Delete. Okay. Compile. Okay, cool. So what you do to do the mapping is after you set up the trigger, like what I did, then you go back here and then you just select which direction you want to map, and then it should match what your action name is. You know, you don't want to have an up and then accidentally map to down or something. That would be confusing. So you just do this and then make sure it's working right for one direction. Save it and then start duplicating everything, every action. So you know, I just basically have up, and then I go clockwise. So it's up, up right, and then right, and then down right, down, down left, left, and then up left. So I just create all these, and then you can go through each one of those and then make sure you change the trigger direction there, and then just save each one of them. And then after you save all of them, then you go to your Pong or player controller. Then you can start putting down those actions like that. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. And once you start, you would have the D-pads working. Yep, that's pretty much it. And I'll try to like zip this project. It should be pretty small, like 100 something kilobyte, and I'll put it together in description. I think I can upload it to the Unreal's like a tutorial, community tutorial site as well. See ya. And then if you have any question, just leave a comment and let me know.